Humboldt Redwood Cut, California, autumn 1898. The air, thick with the scent of damp earth and sawdust, carried the metallic ring of axes and the groan of falling giants. But on a small, overlooked parcel of cut-over land, Manuel Ferreira was engaged in a different kind of labor, one that drew stares first, then chuckles, and finally open mockery from the seasoned loggers who passed by. He wasn't felling trees. He was moving into one, or what was left of it. The stump was a colossus, a relic of a tree that had been a sapling when Rome was a republic. It stood 22 feet tall, a hollowed-out, fire-scarred cylinder of ancient redwood 14 feet in diameter. For decades it had been a landmark, a curiosity, a place for timber cruisers to shelter from a sudden squall. No one saw it as anything more. But Manuel, a recent arrival from the Azores, saw a home. Whitfield Hollifield, the Humboldt County Land Office assessor, stopped his horse, his ledger book balanced on his knee. He was a man who understood the world through plats, deeds, and statutes. What he saw defied all of them. Ferreira, a man of medium height with the thick shoulders of a laborer, was meticulously scraping char from the inside of the hollow stump with a draw knife. A burly logger named Silas Croft, his suspenders stained with pitch, paused beside Hollifield's horse. "What's the Portuguese think he's doing, Hollifield?" Croft asked, a grin splitting his beard. "Gonna make a house for squirrels? Maybe charge 'em rent?" Hollifield made a neat, dry entry in his book. He didn't smile. "It appears, Mr. Croft, that Mr. Ferreira intends to take up residence in the stump himself. A curious interpretation of the Homestead Act, to be sure." He watched as Ferreira began hauling cedar planks toward the gaping maw at the stump's base. The entire endeavor seemed absurd, a profound misunderstanding of how one survived a North Coast winter. The men in the nearby logging camps, men who built stout, if drafty cabins, from fresh milled pine and fir, called it Ferreira's folly. They said the man was foolish, that the damp would rot him out by Christmas, that the cold would find him huddled inside a wooden tomb. The mockery was relentless, but Manuel Ferreira simply kept working, his movements deliberate, his face unreadable. What did this Portuguese cooper, a man whose people on the island of Terceira had for centuries sought shelter in the dry, stable hollows of ancient lava tubes, understand about the thermal physics of wood that the most experienced builders on the California coast had completely missed? What secret did he carry from his volcanic island to this forest of giants? The answer to that question would not only silence the laughter, but would fundamentally reshape the understanding of survival in this wet, cold corner of the world. It's a story of quiet genius, of the wisdom of the outsider, and the immense power of looking at a problem differently. If you stick with me, I promise you will learn something profound about heat, wood, and the simple elegance of working with nature, not against it. Be sure to subscribe and hit the like button if you appreciate stories of overlooked ingenuity. And let me know in the comments, what's the most unconventional home you've ever seen or heard of? Manuel Ferreira was not a carpenter, not a logger in the American sense, and certainly not a frontiersman. He was a cooper. His hands were trained to the curve of an oak stave, the precise bevel of a joint, the satisfying finality of driving hoops onto a barrel. His entire professional life was about creating vessels, containers that held their contents, whether wine, water, or salted fish, perfectly sealed from the outside world. He understood integrity, the wholeness of a structure. He came from Terceira, one of the 9 islands of the Azores, a place of dramatic green cliffs and black volcanic rock. He and his wife, Sophia, had come to America not for gold, but for the promise of land and wages in the booming timber trade. Their two children, 7-year-old Inés and 5-year-old João, had been born in the Azores, their first language the soft, melodic Portuguese of the islands. Their first winter in Humboldt had been a brutal education and failure. They lived in a standard-issue company cabin, a single-story box of green, unseasoned pine boards with battens tacked over the gaps. It was a sieve. The cold didn't just seep in, it poured. That winter, Manuel saw things he'd never imagined. He watched his neighbor Jedediah Black's brand-new peavey, the stout hickory handle a point of pride, snap at the metal pivot on its first pry of a frozen log. The cold had made the steel brittle as glass. He'd seen a timber cruiser, a man paid to count and measure trees, stare in disbelief as the ink in his bottle froze solid at the section corner. His day's work lost. The most chilling memory was personal. One morning, after a night when the fire had died to embers, Manuel went to grab his heavy wool coat from the peg where it hung. As he swung it around his shoulders, the fabric didn't bend, it cracked, a sharp, tearing sound like splitting wood. The frozen moisture in the wool had turned the garment into a fragile shell. Sophia had bundled Inés and João in every blanket they owned, their small faces pale, their breath pluming in the air inside their own home. That night, huddled by the stove, feeding it precious wood that seemed to vanish into heatless smoke, Manuel thought of Terceira. He thought of the furnace, the ancient, hollow lava tubes that riddled the island's interior. As a boy, he'd played in them. Some families, generations back, had lived in them. They were naturally dry, and their thick stone walls held a constant cool temperature, impervious to the Atlantic gales outside. A lava tube was a perfect vessel. A cabin of thin pine boards was not. When spring came, Manuel told Sophia his plan. He had spent weeks walking the cutover lands, not looking for timber, but for a vessel. He found it in the giant fire-hollowed redwood. Sophia listened, her expression serious. She looked at the thin walls of their cabin, then back at her husband's steady eyes. "It will look strange, Manuel," she said, her voice quiet. "The neighbors will talk." She paused, pulling her shawl tighter. "But our first cabin looked normal, and it tried to freeze us. Build your barrel. We will live inside." The failure of the conventional frontier cabin wasn't a matter of poor craftsmanship. It was a failure of physics, especially in the unique climate of the North Coast. The standard dwelling was a box of 1-inch thick pine or fir boards. In the rush to build, the wood was often used green, full of moisture. As it dried, it shrank, opening up countless gaps between the boards. The battens tacked over them were a crude patch, but they couldn't stop the air. The problem wasn't just drafts, it was a cascade of thermal failures. The first was conduction. A 1-inch pine board has an R value of about 1. R value is the measure of thermal resistance. The higher the number, the better the insulation. An R value of 1 is practically nothing. Heat flowed directly through the wood as if it were hardly there. Families would have a stove roaring, but if you put your hand on the wall a few feet away, it felt icy. That cold wall was a heat vampire. The second failure was convection. Inside the cabin, the stove heated the air. Hot air rises, moves to the cold walls and ceiling, cools, and sinks back to the floor, creating a constant, miserable, circular draft. This convective loop meant that even with a fire going, your head could be sweating while your feet were freezing. It also meant the warmest air was constantly being delivered to the coldest surfaces, where its heat was instantly lost. The third, and perhaps most insidious failure on the damp coast, was radiation. Every object radiates heat to the colder objects around it. A human body at 98.6 degrees, sitting in a room with walls at 35 degrees, will radiate its own warmth directly to those walls. You feel a chill, not because of a draft, but because your own body heat is being pulled away from you by the vast, cold surfaces around you. The families in the logging camps, like the Crofts and the Blacks, were caught in a desperate cycle. They burned enormous quantities of wood, 5, 6, 7 cords a winter, just to maintain a barely livable temperature. The intense heat from the stove would drive moisture out of the green wood of the cabin walls, making the air humid. This moisture would then hit the cold window panes and the upper walls, where it would condense and freeze, coating the inside of their homes with a layer of ice. They were living in frozen, man-made swamps, endlessly fighting a battle against physics they couldn't win. The North Coast polar rain freeze was not a dry, crisp cold. It was a wet, penetrating cold that clung to everything, and the standard cabin was tragically, fundamentally unequipped to handle it. Manuel Ferreira's project began not with a hammer, but with a shovel and a scraper. For a week, he cleared the accumulated debris of a century from the floor of the stump, layers of leaf mold, animal nests, and the charcoal from countless small fires lit by passing hunters. The floor was damp, earthen, and smelled of decay. He knew any structure built directly on it would rot. His solution came from his cooper's training. A barrel doesn't sit flat on the ground. It has a chime, a raised edge. He would build his own chime. Using salvaged timber for joists, he constructed a round, heavy-duty frame 3 feet above the ground. This created a crucial dead air space, a buffer against the cold, damp earth. On top of this frame, he laid a beautiful, tight-fitting floor of cedar planks, their edges meeting with a precision that impressed the few who bothered to look closely. The circular floor was 154 square feet of clean, dry space, floating above the forest floor. Next, the entrance. He used a crosscut saw to carefully widen and square a section of the fire-scarred opening, creating a frame for a proper door. He built the door itself from 2 layers of thick oak planks, heavy and solid. Inside the door, he hung a curtain made from 2 heavy wool blankets stitched together, a simple but effective airlock to stop drafts when the door was opened. The mockery from the loggers continued through the summer. They saw him hauling materials and couldn't comprehend the scale of his intent. "Still building your nest, Ferreira?" Silas Croft would call out. "Hope you got room for the missus and the chicks in there." Manuel's response was always the same, a slight nod and a return to his work. He was not building a nest. He was finishing a vessel. The most difficult part was the chimney. A stove without a proper draw is a death trap, filling a space with smoke and carbon monoxide. The stump's crown, 22 feet up, was a ragged, broken opening to the sky, but it had a natural fissure running down one side, a deep channel carved by some ancient trauma. Over the course of 2 weeks, using ropes and a precarious ladder, Manuel painstakingly fed sections of stovepipe up this fissure, securing them to the woody interior. It was dangerous, painstaking work, high above the ground, but he knew it was the heart of the entire system. When it was done, the small potbelly stove sat near the center of the cedar floor, its pipe rising straight up and vanishing into the wooden heights. In late April, as the forest was greening with new life, Whitfield Hollifield returned. This time he was not a curious observer. He rode up, dismounted, and approached Manuel with an official-looking document in hand. His tone was no longer wry. It was formal, tinged with bureaucratic regret. "Mr. Ferreira," he began, "I have to address the nature of this structure." He gestured to the stump. "I've reviewed the statutes, specifically the California Cutover Timber Statute of 1897. This stump, as it is part of the original forest and not a man-made improvement, is technically on federal land. It is not a designated homestead plot, and erecting a permanent dwelling within it is a violation. He handed the paper to Manuel. This is an official citation. I'm afraid you'll have to vacate the premises. Given that you have a family, I can put the date for compliance as the 1st of October before the winter rains. Manuel took the paper. He read the legal text, his expression unchanging. He looked at Hollyfield, then at the nearly finished home his hands had shaped. "Understood," he said quietly. Then he turned, picked up a piece of cedar, and went back to fitting the last section of his floor. Hollyfield, having performed his duty, mounted his horse and rode away, shaking his head at the quiet man's strange, doomed persistence. To the loggers and homesteaders of Humboldt County, the giant redwood stump was just a very thick wall. To Manuel Ferreira, the cooper, it was a perfectly engineered thermal envelope, a gift of nature that no man could hope to build. The science behind his intuition was staggering. The walls of the stump were, on average, 2 feet thick. That's 24 inches of solid, old-growth redwood. In the world of thermodynamics, redwood is a remarkable insulator, possessing an R value of approximately 1.5 per inch of thickness. R value measures a material's resistance to heat flow, so, for Manuel's stump, the calculation was simple. 24 inches multiplied by an R value of 1.5 equals an astonishing R36. To put that in perspective, the 1-inch pine boards on a conventional cabin had an R value of 1. A log cabin with 6-inch logs might reach R8. Manuel's home was, in terms of insulation, the equivalent of 36 layers of pine boards, or more than 4 solid log cabins stacked one inside the other. It wasn't just a wall, it was a fortress against the cold. But insulation was only half the equation. The other half was thermal mass. The sheer volume and weight of the wood in the 22-foot-tall stump was immense, likely weighing over 100 tons. This enormous mass acted like a thermal battery. In cold weather, it would take days for the chill to penetrate the outer layers of the wood. Once the small interior was warmed up, that heat would soak into the inner layers of the massive walls. The wood itself would hold the warmth, radiating it gently back into the living space long after the fire in the stove died down. Manuel's design capitalized on these properties perfectly. The 154-square-foot circular floor defined a small, easily heated volume of air. Engineers today could calculate the heat loss precisely to maintain an interior temperature of 68 degrees Fahrenheit against an outside temperature of 22 degrees. With an R36 envelope, the structure would lose only about 2,000 BTUs per hour. A small potbelly stove, the kind Manuel had installed, could easily produce 8,000 to 12,000 BTUs per hour, burning just a few pieces of wood. He wouldn't need a roaring fire. He would need a tiny, smoldering one. This was the secret to his incredible fuel efficiency, the prediction that he could stay warm on an eighth of the wood his neighbors burned. Furthermore, the redwood itself was a miracle of preservation. The wood is saturated with tannins, natural chemical compounds that make it intensely resistant to rot and insects. While a pine cabin built on the damp ground would begin to decay in a few years, Manuel's redwood vessel had already stood for over 2,000 years, surviving fire and flood. It would easily stand for another. It was the perfect material, in the perfect shape, waiting for someone with the right eyes to see it, not as a relic of the past, but as a blueprint for the future. The winter arrived not with a gentle frosting, but as a sudden, brutal siege. It was a weather pattern unique to the North Coast, a phenomenon the old-timers called a polar rain freeze. For 8 consecutive days, the temperature hovered at a relentless 22 degrees Fahrenheit. But it was not a dry, clear cold. A thick, supercooled coastal fog rolled in from the Pacific, a mist so cold that it froze on contact with any surface. This was accompanied by a steady 15-mile-per-hour wind from the southeast that drove the damp chill into every conceivable crack and crevice. Soon, the entire landscape was transformed. Every fern frond, every branch, every blade of grass was coated in a thick, fuzzy layer of wet hoarfrost. The world looked beautiful, but it was a deadly beauty. The weight of the ice brought down branches with loud cracks that echoed through the forest. Travel became treacherous. For the families in the conventional cabins, it was a nightmare. The wind defeated their flimsy walls. The damp cold leached the heat from their fires. At the Croft cabin, Silas and his wife spent their days stuffing rags and old newspapers into the widening gaps in their walls, a futile effort. They kept the stove glowing red hot, but the ice still formed on the nails inside their walls, and a thick layer of frost grew across the floor in the corners of the room. Their children slept in their coats, huddled together in one bed. At Jedediah Black's homestead, things were worse. His small herd of cattle, seeking shelter in a lean-to, began to suffer. The wet cold was more dangerous than dry snow. 2 of his calves, unable to withstand the prolonged chill, were lost, freezing where they stood. The daily struggle was elemental, keeping the fire alive, melting ice for water, and simply enduring the oppressive, bone-deep cold that never, ever left. But inside the stump, a different reality was unfolding. Manuel, Sofia, Inez, and João Ferreira were not just surviving, they were living. The tiny pot-belly stove consumed a surprisingly small amount of wood, just a few logs a day. It emitted a steady, gentle warmth. The 2-foot-thick redwood walls, a massive barrier of R36 insulation, held that warmth perfectly. The air inside was still, dry, and comfortable. There were no drafts, no convective loops pulling heat away. The massive thermal battery of the ancient wood radiated a gentle, even heat, back into the circular room. The proof of this alternate reality was in the small domestic details. On a shelf carved into the thick wood of the stump wall sat a large ceramic crock. Inside was a batch of caldo verde, a traditional Portuguese soup of potatoes, kale, and sausage that Sophia had made. In any other cabin in Humboldt County, that crock and its contents would have been a frozen, solid block within hours of the fire being banked. But here, in the gentle, stable warmth of the stump, the soup remained liquid. It stayed warm green, ready to be ladled out. A taste of home. A testament to the fact that for the Ferreira family, winter was happening somewhere else. While their neighbors shivered, 7-year-old Inez sat on a small stool near the stove, her feet on the warm cedar floor, lost in a book, wearing only a simple shirt and trousers. The brutal siege outside could not touch them. On the 6th day of the freeze, Whitfield Hollifield was making his rounds. It was a grim duty, checking on the isolated homesteads scattered across the cut-over lands. His mood was as bleak as the gray, frozen sky. His horse was skittish on the icy trails, and the cold had worked its way through his oilskin coat and wool layers, settling deep in his bones. He had just left the black homestead, the sight of the frozen cattle heavy on his mind. His route took him past Ferreira's Folly. As he neared the colossal stump, his mule, stepping onto the short plank causeway Manuel had built over a perennially muddy patch, suddenly lost its footing on the ice-slicked wood. The animal went down with a panicked grunt. Hollifield was thrown clear, landing hard in a frozen bank of ferns. He was unhurt, but shaken, angry, and colder than ever. He got the trembling mule back to its feet and saw the faint, almost invisible wisp of smoke rising from the stovepipe high atop the stump. He needed a moment to collect himself, to get out of the biting wind. He stomped toward the small oak door, his mind set on reminding Ferreira of the eviction order. his frustration with the man's foolishness now sharpened by the fall. This entire ridiculous project was a hazard. He didn't knock. He shoved the heavy door inward and stepped through, bracing for the blast of damp, smoky air he expected in any cabin that was losing its fight with the cold. But the blast never came. What he felt was stillness, a profound, enveloping quiet of warm, perfectly dry air. It was a physical shock. The feeling washed over his face and the exposed skin of his wrists, melting the ice crystals in his beard. He automatically began to unbutton his heavy, stiff coat, an unconscious act of a body moving from a hostile environment to a welcoming one. His eyes adjusted to the soft light from a single lantern. He saw the clean, dry cedar planks of the floor beneath his muddy, ice-caked boots. He saw the small, dark stove glowing with a gentle, contained heat. And then he saw the girl. Manuel's daughter, Inés, was sitting on a low stool, her back against the curved redwood wall. She was reading a book, her expression one of complete absorption. She was wearing simple shirt sleeves. Hollyfield stood there, dripping on the floor, his coat half open. He looked from the comfortable child to the massive, curving walls that rose up into the shadows. He reached out a bare, numb hand and laid his palm flat against the wood. He expected to feel the biting cold of the 22-degree air that was just 2 feet away. Instead, what he felt was a faint, deep, resonant warmth. It was the feeling of life. Manuel looked up from where he was mending a harness and simply nodded. "Mr. Hollifield." The assessor couldn't find the words he had planned to say. The eviction notice, the statutes, the official reprimand, they all evaporated in the gentle heat of the room. He could only stare at the impossible reality around him. He finally found his voice, but it was quiet, filled with a dawning awe. He looked at Manuel, then back at the wall, and a new understanding settled in his mind. "My God, Ferreira," he whispered, the words catching in his throat. "You didn't build a wall against the cold. You hollowed out a piece of summer." Whitfield Hollifield did not mention the eviction that day. He sat for a few minutes on a stool offered by Sophia, sipping a mug of hot tea that warmed his hands and his spirit. He said little, but his eyes missed nothing: the lack of frost on the walls, the sleeping toddler João in a cot, breathing easily, the crock of green soup on the shelf, not steaming but clearly unfrozen. When he left, he was a changed man. The world no longer seemed to be made of neat lines on a surveyor's map. He never filed the final eviction papers. Instead, a few weeks later, back in the relative civilization of Eureka, he met an acquaintance, a journalist for a Colonia Portuguesa, a small but respected Portuguese-language newspaper based in San Francisco that served the growing immigrant community across California. Over a drink, Hollifield, a man not given to storytelling, found himself describing what he had seen. He didn't portray it as a curiosity, but as an engineering marvel. He used the words Manuel had quietly supplied when asked: the thickness of the walls, the raised floor, the astonishingly small amount of firewood. In March of 1899, the story appeared in print. Lar dentro de uma gigante, the headline read, "A home inside a giant." The article was detailed, practical. It spoke of the Ferreira family's comfort during the great polar rain freeze. It mentioned the R value, not as an abstract number, but as a shield. It described the caldo verde that never froze. The paper circulated through the Portuguese communities, passed from hand to hand in logging camps and fishing villages from Monterey to the Oregon border. For most readers, it was a charming tale. But for a handful of Azorean families working the timber claims in the remote corners of Humboldt and Mendocino counties, it was a revelation. These were men who, like Manuel, understood the logic of the earth. They knew the furnace of their homeland. They read the article not as a story, but as an instruction manual. That spring, a cutter named Carvalho, working a claim near the Matole River, found his own hollow giant. Another family, the Silvas, near present-day Garberville, did the same. They followed Ferreira's model: the raised cedar floor, the carefully fitted door, the vented stove. They traded letters, sharing small improvements and techniques. By the autumn of 1899, as the coastal winds began to carry the first hint of winter, 4 other Azorean families had moved into their own redwood stump homes. The idea was spreading, not through official channels or architectural plans, but through a shared cultural memory, a community's recognition of a familiar wisdom in a new land. Ferreira's folly had become Ferreira's method. The simple genius of Manuel Ferreira's stump house was that it anticipated, by nearly a century, the core principles of modern high-performance building science. What he intuited from his cooper's trade and his Azorean heritage, engineers today call a super-insulated envelope. The goal of a modern passive house or a net-zero energy home is to create a continuous, unbroken layer of insulation around the entire living space, walls, floor, and roof, to stop thermal bridging and minimize heat loss. Manuel's stump was the ultimate expression of this, a seamless, 24-inch thick R36 blanket of natural insulation provided by the tree itself. Modern builders go to extraordinary lengths to create airtightness using special membranes, tapes, and sealants to stop the uncontrolled air leakage that plagues conventional construction. Manuel achieved a similar result through the sheer integrity of his vessel. The solid wood walls had no seams, no joints, no gaps for wind to penetrate. His simple wool curtain behind the solid oak door was a primitive but effective airlock. Today, we talk about the importance of thermal mass in passive solar design, using concrete floors or masonry walls to absorb and store the sun's heat. Manuel's home was a masterclass in thermal mass. The hundreds of tons of wood acted as a massive heat sink, creating a level of thermal stability that modern homes struggle to replicate. This flywheel effect meant the temperature inside swung by only a few degrees over a 24-hour period, regardless of the weather outside. It's why his small stove was so effective. It wasn't fighting a constant battle to replace lost heat, but merely topping up the vast store of warmth already held in the walls. The stump house was, in essence, a high-performance, organic, living structure. Manuel Ferreira hadn't just built a shelter, he had created a microclimate. The story of Manuel Ferreira's stump house is more than a tale of frontier ingenuity. It's a quiet lesson in philosophy. The prevailing mindset of the American frontier was one of conflict with nature. The wilderness was an adversary to be conquered, tamed, and subdued. Forests were cleared, mountains were tunneled, and rivers were dammed. Settlers built their homes against the wilderness, their thin walls a fragile declaration of human dominance over the elements. This approach was born of courage and necessity, but it was also locked in a perpetual, exhausting struggle. Manuel Ferreira operated from a different tradition. His was the worldview of an islander, a man whose ancestors had lived for centuries on volcanic rock in the middle of a vast ocean. On Terceira, you did not fight the volcano, and you did not command the sea. You learned their rhythms, you respected their power, and you found ways to live within the shelter they provided. You adapted to the world as it was, not as you wished it to be. When he looked at the giant, hollowed-out redwood, he didn't see a challenge or an obstacle. He saw an invitation. Where others saw a ruin, he saw a vessel of immense strength and integrity. The loggers who mocked him saw the world as a collection of raw materials to be harvested and reassembled. Manuel saw a finished piece of architecture, designed by time and fire, waiting for an occupant. He didn't seek to impose his own will upon the landscape. He sought to collaborate with it. His act of building was one of listening. He listened to the wood, understanding its insulating power. He listened to the earth, raising his floor above its dampness. He listened to the air, giving his small fire a path to the sky. He didn't build a cabin against a cold coast. He asked a 2,000-year-old tree to be his walls and lit a small fire inside. In that simple, humble act, he achieved a level of comfort, security, and grace that all the axes and saws in Humboldt County could not match. It was a reminder that sometimes the greatest strength lies not in conquering nature, but in having the wisdom to accept its sanctuary. Thank you for joining us for this story of quiet triumph. We hope it gave you a new appreciation for the hidden wisdom in the world around us. Please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more stories of historical ingenuity. Let us know in the comments what you think of Manuel's solution. The video you have just watched presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictional, while the techniques and scientific principles are based on real historical practices and knowledge. Should you consider applying any of these principles in a modern context, it is imperative to consult with qualified professionals and adhere to all current building codes, safety guidelines, and local regulations. This content does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.